Foreign wrestlers in Japan is a pretty common subject for this channel, and for the most part we've covered some pretty glittering examples of success in that field. Stan Hansen, Vader, The Funks, Steve Williams, all of these guys did admirably well. However, obviously there's a lot more folks out there who made that big trip over, halfway across the world, to take part in pro res, whether it be for the big companies like All Japan and New Japan, or for some of the smaller and more specific promotions dealing in junior wrestling, or Shootstyle. And a lot of those names are quite curious indeed. They're not failures or anything like that. Sure, no one who I'm looking at was quite at the huge level of the foreign talents I've just mentioned, but they certainly played their part, and they're definitely names that you're going to know. Generally speaking, with this video I'm looking at the lesser known parts of the careers of some famous wrestlers, and we're definitely going to find some decent work here. And again, not just in the big two. There's 4 names we've got here ready to be covered in some detail, so let's get on with it. If nothing else, it's a rather different idea for a classic YouTube wrestling listicle. Our first guy is a classic big heavyweight, not perhaps at the elite Vader level, but someone with a good skill set who was a hell of a lot more athletic than you might think, put together a career filled with memorable stuff, and always had a good character about them. It's the Big Boss Man. Or perhaps more accurately for this video, Big Bubba Rogers. Ray Traylor, if we're going to use his government name. Anywho, Traylor is obviously best known for his time in the WWF as a hard-ass prison guard from Cobb County, Georgia. During his first one, he was one of the better heel Hogan opponents before switching up to face and being quite over, and then he came back in the Attitude Era. While wrestling itself weren't great then, Bossman did shine as a mid-card enforcer and general complete arsehole who did things like drive off with Big Show's dead dad and serve Al Snow steaks made out of his dog. Anyway, the Bossman's excursions to Japan took place on either side of his first WWF one. He was there for a tour in March and April of 1988, and he then had a more substantial one of a few months in the second half of '93 after leaving. During that time he'd put a few little achievements on his CV. He'd take on all of the 4 pillars, compete in the Real World Tag League, and actually have a few neat little matches. There's not too much to speak of when it comes to Big Bubba's first tour, which happened during spring 1988 on the usual Champion Carnival one, although we get some intriguing tag combos. Largely the booking for Bubba on this tour saw him teaming up with Bruiser Brody, this would actually be Brody's last ever tour for All Japan, and facing off against teams that for the most part included Jumbo Tsuruta and a Canadian guy who All Japan were working on as a bit of a project, that being John Tenta. The future Bossman and Earthquake would wrestle to a double countout on this tour. Sadly, there's no footage of that. Now, the big bouts of this tour involve Brody and Tsuruta swapping the NWA International title. Brody beat Tsuruta for it at the start in Tokyo, and then Jumbo won it back a little over a month later in Sendai. And a couple of days after winning back the belt, Jumbo actually faced Big Bubba in a non-title singles match on April 22nd, and we get a decent little match there. Bubba's got some of his signature spots and particularly his really good selling in place here, which is cool when you think that he hadn't actually been wrestling all that long. Kind of a shame the match itself's only 7 minutes or so, really. Jumbo gets the expected win, although he does it with a leg lock submission, which is kind of unusual for him. We get a fair bit of good interplay between Bubba and Jumbo throughout the tour, really. From the matches that are out there, there's quite a lot of nice stuff. Another curious match is a tag. This time Jumbo Tsuruta's teaming with a more regular partner at the time, Tiger Mask, meaning Mitsuharu Misawa. Big Bubba has more great interactions with both Jumbo and Misawa, and his partner is none other than, Tom McGee. You know, the guy who Bret Hart carried to a classic in a near mythical house show match. McGee, bless him, does stink up the joint every time he does anything in this bout, but the rest of it is cool indeed. We do only have this one tour of the even younger Big Bubba Rogers in 80s AJPW, still in his early 20s here, because he'd already signed up with Titan before it even began, and just a couple of weeks after this tour was over, the Big Boss Man made his WWF debut. Definitely leaves you interested in seeing more though. Fast forward to 1993, and Big Boss Man stops appearing on WWF TV round about March. In July he makes his return to All Japan and will work there for the rest of the year. He is once again billed as Big Bubba Rogers, although it is kind of odd. He still wrestles in his Big Boss Man gear. Even better than that, his theme song is actually a cover of the Serving Hard Time theme, done by All Japan's house band. Have a quick listen.
You know the big boss man will make you walk the line. You better watch your boy.
Now the deal here is a complicated one. By all accounts, Bossman was still under contract with the Fed and his bookings were handled by them, so I guess you could say that he was out on a loan deal of sorts that would also see him working in places like the USWA and Smoky Mountain in the States, as well as a brief tour of Australia. Anyway, we get a lot more fine Bossman action here. In particular, anything he does with Kenta Kobashi. On the 14th of October, Kobashi and Bubba have an absolutely excellent singles bout that's probably the best of Bossman's career. Obviously this is a time when Kobashi can do no one, but Bossman puts in a great account of himself. I think that over time his work has quite rightly been reappraised and appreciated a whole lot more than it was then, and that's thoroughly justifiable when you look at this All Japan 1 where he's basically not putting a foot one, working in a realistic way that's not as stiff as the All Japan norm, but still looks really good. Another general highlight is his run in the Real World Tag League, where he's teamed up with Steve Williams. The team ends up scoring 8 points, and we get even more great little bouts against the likes of the Holy Demon Army and the Super Generation Army. By and large, anything Bossman in 1993 is worth watching, and who knows, maybe if he'd ended up sticking around there, he might have been in a pretty high position. He certainly got over with the crowd. As it is, this whole deal ended when Big Boss Man made the very surprising jump over to WCW right at the end of '93, essentially replacing Davey Boy Smith in the company after he'd been fired over one too many no-shows. Bossman had been working house shows for the Fed as late as a few days before the jump and was scheduled for a WWF TV return in '94, so this news did come as a bit of an ugly shock and there were threats of legal action. Bossman's All Japan 1 ends up being a pretty good one, and it does kind of leave you wanting more. 1993 especially is the best in-ring work of his career, and just about every appearance he makes is worth a look. It should also be noted that Bossman's final ever wrestling matches were also in Japan. He worked 2 tours for IWA Japan in March and August of 2004, with his last ever match being in a title tournament final against Hacksaw Jim Duggan on August 31st. Sadly, Ray Traylor would pass away 3 weeks later on September 22nd of a heart attack at the far too young age of 41. Our next 2 entries take us into the world of Shootstyle. Now if you want some odd little appearances from names you really wouldn't expect, well, Shootstyle is definitely a good place to look. Not only do you get the runs from guys who weren't pro wrestlers but put in absolutely awesome bouts in the likes of Rins, your Volk Hans and what have you, you may get the odd fella who really seems like a fish out of water. And again, it's often worth watching. And so, let's have a look at Bob Backlund. Mr. Howdy Doody himself, Bob Backlund made appearances for the UWF in 1988 and 1989, and for UWF International in 1991. As a matter of fact, his arrival in the UWF for a bout against Nobuhiko Takada in December 1988 was the first time he'd been in the ring in nearly 3.5 years. He left the WWF not too long after the end of his nearly 6-year title reign, spent a chunk of 1985 in the NWA and USA Pro Wrestling, and after that he mainly taught amateur wrestling back in Connecticut. That is, until he got pulled back in. Backlund certainly had name value in Japan after all, particularly from his bouts against Antonio Inoki, who defeated him in November 1979 to briefly hold the WWF title in a reign that's not officially recognised by the Fed. The Backlund-Takada match would main event the UWF's Osaka Superbout card on December 22nd, and it sold out the Osaka Prefectural Gym. In the booking, Takada was chosen as Backlund's opponent as the result of a rather surprising victory against Akira Maeda on November the 10th, with this basically being the UWF's 2 biggest names fighting to see who was going to take on Backlund. You can clearly see that UWF were presenting this match as a big deal. The match itself? It's a corker. It may well be the best of Bob Backlund's whole career. Backlund's here for his scientific wrestling and legit amateur skills, and it turns out he's a pretty good fit here. We do get some of Backlund's signature goofiness, and his forearm smashes are perhaps more traditionally pro wrestling than they are shoot style, but it still works well, and by and large we get a quite intense battle of wits on the mat between Backlund and Takada. There's no commentary in UWF, which also kind of works, especially seeing as Backlund is very vocal and you get all the whoa whoa whoas you can eat. Also, the crowd is really hot for it. Again, Japanese crowds aren't always as quiet as some people like to say they are. Here, damn near every move on the mat is greeted with roars, and any big moves come with tons of foot stamping, especially as we near the end of this 25-minute clash, and the bout really moves through the gears, with both wrestlers exchanging some pretty major downs and rope escapes, as well as some pretty awesome moves. There's one in particular where Backlund, whose strength levels are off the charts, practically throws Takada halfway across the ring with a butterfly suplex. It certainly shows on the guys during the match as well. Backlund ends up with a busted nose from Takada's kicks, and Takada gets a raspberry on his eye after a stiff boot scrape. In something of an odd turn, the ending here is a little bit screwy for Shootstyle. Takada finally manages to trap Backlund in a Kimura, but Backlund's clearly not going to give up, and the referee calls the bout as a TKO win for Takada, which Backlund sells like he's just been cheated, saying that he's never going to come back to Japan again. Anyway, if you like some really high quality mat wrestling, complete with some cracking build up to the major exchanges, you'll want to watch this one. It is an absolutely fantastic match. Now, as great as this match was, there's a fair bit of word that Backlund himself wasn't popular with the UWF crew, largely because they felt he was very, well, pro-wrestling. Some of his favoured spots were completely rejected, such as his arm scissor counter where he deadlifts a guy and sets them on the turnbuckle. He goes for it in the Takada match, but Takada immediately releases the hold. His second match will provide even more evidence for this. Initially, Backlund was supposed to rematch Takada on May 4th, 1989, but this didn't happen, and instead he faced Masaharu Funaki, later Masakatsu Funaki, on May 21st. Funaki had very recently jumped ship to the UWF from New Japan, and he's going to end up pretty great. And well, this match will definitely have moments too, but they sure don't play nice with each other. Backlund comes into the ring already sporting a whopping great shiner on his left eye, which he may well have received from Funaki due to some pretty stiff dojo sparring prior to the contest. We get some pretty tasty exchanges here, some nasty kicks, a few big slaps, and definite laid-in shots. In fact, it almost seems as though Funaki is taking some liberties here with Backlund, and as much as he himself is pretty legit, obviously, I dread to think what would have happened if this had gone totally out of control. Backlund is, after all, legitimately one of the strongest men to ever step foot into the squared circle. We get another odd ending here. Backlund does the aforementioned arm scissor counter and puts Funaki on the turnbuckle, and Funaki replies with a missile dropkick. Moves off the turnbuckle like this are totally banned in UWF, and this results in Funaki getting DQ'd. A good match still, but definitely a weird one. There's also this great pic from after the match with old Bob having a beer. And yeah, you can see it's been a pretty tough encounter. Fast forward a couple of years, and we get to UWF International. Here, Takada is now the top star, and there's a lot of interest in seeing him face off against Backlund again. And so they rematch on the 26th of September in Sapporo, and it goes badly wrong. We get some good forearms and a really sweet backdrop from Bob to kick things off, but then only a minute or so into the bout, Takada catches Backlund with an exceptionally hard kick, and Backlund was unable to answer the 10 count. It should be said that by all accounts, this was not a Koji Kitao head kick type incident. It does appear that this was either actually the planned finish, or the stiff kick was a complete accident. Now, the crowd were utterly pissed at the short match, almost to the point of rioting. It took Kazuo Yamazaki and Backlund himself to calm them down, with Backlund saying that when he faced Takada again in November, he'd be sure to block those kicks better. The rematch happens on November the 7th at the venue of their first encounter, the Osaka Prefectural Gym, and while it's not as good as their first big match here, it's still pretty damn excellent. These two just have an electric charisma, even if their styles do clash, and at its most intense, watching Backlund and Takada going at it is just exhilarating. More big old strikes, absolutely rapid fire mat work, and a couple of more amazing suplexes. I think it was Meltzer who was largely responsible for the narrative suggesting that Backlund was always bad. Frankly, that couldn't have been further from the truth. The match goes around 15 minutes this time, although annoyingly the version that I have, from the old European Bushido programs, cuts half of it. The finish sees Backlund go all out with a butterfly suplex and then a belly to back, but Takada is able to lock in a Kimura off the last suplex, and he gets the submission. It is, at last, his decisive win over Bob Backlund. Once again, this match is highly recommended. Bob's third and final match with UWFi took place on their biggest card to date, the December 22nd show at Sumo Hall that was headlined by the utterly infamous and frankly hilarious Takada vs Trevor Berbick screwjob. Here he faces Yoji Anjo in what is largely a decent and mat-based contest. Not as good as the other bouts, but it progresses nicely. Backlund gets a big show of strength by deadlifting Anjo for a suplex, and wins the bout by submitting Anjo with the most feared move of them all, the crossface chicken win. Now, Bob Backlund in Shootstyle is one of those things that leaves you absolutely itching for more. Why couldn't we have had more than these 5 matches? It seems as if there was always a bit of actual friction between Backlund and both UWF and UWFi, that his style had too much of the pro wrestling about it, or that he was too damn goofy and too damn, well, Bob Backlund. And that's why we only have this handful of matches kicking around, even though he was a named talent and very much over with the Japanese crowds. Damn it, every last bit of these matches is at least good, and the first match against Takada in particular is a flat-out classic that everyone should watch immediately. It sure beat getting no reaction on his summer 1992 WWF return, at least until his heel turn. It's no surprise that Backlund, as squeaky clean and outrageously conditioned as he was, and indeed still is, hadn't lost any kind of step in these matches despite the time he'd spent out of the ring, but they're better than even the most generous of expectations. Other things that should be briefly mentioned. Bob Backlund did do a few matches in 1994 and 95 for Wrestle Association R as part of that company's relationship with WWF, although there don't seem to be much kicking around about it. More interestingly, Backlund's last matches to date happened in April 2018 in the Japanese indie tradition, teaming with fellow legends Riki Choshu and Tatsumi Fujinami. And at the age of 68, yeah, he still looked in fantastic shape, moving around pretty much the same as ever. He may be goofy as all hell, but you can't help but love Bob Backlund for it. Howdy doody for life. Next up, we have someone who is, well, not quite as good as Bob Backlund, but could perhaps be even more of a fish out of water. It's one of the most sports entertainment-iest wrestlers of them all, Glen Jacobs, who is obviously most famous as Kane. Now, Jacobs is definitely well known for his gimmicks. He did, after all, have lots of them. Even before joining the WWF in 1995, he'd had a fair few odd ones. It all started in Memphis in 1992, when he came in as the Christmas Creature, which is, well, the name kind of says it all, doesn't it? He had a single match in WCW against Stin in 1993, wrestling as Bruiser Mastino, which on the face of it seems generic, although weirdly he is actually the second Bruiser Mastino. The first one wrestled in CWA over in Germany, his real name was Mike Halek, and you likely know him better as Mantor. Who needs fake Diesel when you've got fake Bruiser Mastino? Speaking of CWA, Jacobs wrestled there too in 1994, mainly as Spartacus. There's a bit of footage of that kicking about where he's up against Dolph Herman and the like. And just before he came to WWF and started doing the evil dentist shtick, he was in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and playing Unabomb. Hell, he even had a match with Undertaker there that apparently was crucial to getting him signed. With so many wild gimmicks under his belt, you may wonder if Glen Jacobs ever actually wrestled as, well, you know, Glen Jacobs, at least for any length of time. And the answer is, yes, he did. in Japan in 1993 and 1994 for a Shootstyle promotion. The Shootstyle promotion in question was Fujiwara Gumi, named after its founder and all-time great, Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Fujiwara Gumi, or PWFG, is definitely the least known of the three promotions that started after the breakup of the newborn UWF, the other two being UWFi and RINS. However, that doesn't mean it's not worth looking at, or that it wasn't important. Three of PWFG's biggest stars would go on to play a crucial role in the formation and popularity of MMA in Japan in the shape of Pancrase, Minoru Suzuki, Masakatsu Funaki, and the company's top foreign talent, Ken Shamrock, who back then was wrestling as Wayne Shamrock. There are some other notable things about the promotion. They frequently had both men and women on their cards, usually Joshi wrestlers from LLPW, which was the closest thing to a women's shoot-style promotion, and they would even won a couple of intergender matches when such things were virtually unheard of. These mostly involved LLPW top star Shinobu Kandori taking on Fujiwara, who trained her. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about PWFG to go along with the high quality of their shoot-style wrestling, and there's plenty of strong names kicking around on their cards. The role of Glen Jacobs in all of this is, of course, pretty minor, but he did have a few matches there, and they were mostly against pretty decent names. Happily, a couple of these bouts are available for us to watch. Right at the end of 1993, Jacobs had a little bout against Yoshiaki Fujiwara himself, one that's pretty much entirely based around the mat. And yeah, it is kind of strange to see a near 7-foot guy who would go on to be Kane in this sort of situation. It's not exactly surprising that Fujiwara, one of the greatest grapplers of them all, goes on to win this bout after around 5 or so minutes with a leg lock, but big old Jacobs does at least try to hang. The other handful of singles matches are perhaps more fun, however. They're against Yuki Ishikawa and Daisuke Aikida, two of the main guys who'd later go on to head up the absolute awesomeness that was Battle Arts. There's two bouts against Ishikawa. Here we get some even faster mat work, and we get some pretty stiff exchanges too, with a good few slaps and all of that. Again, kind of intriguing. Jacobs is, to his credit, known as a ridiculously safe pair of hands who's basically never injured anyone in his whole career, so it's a novelty in itself to see him going hard and working stiff with guys like Ishikawa and Aikida. Jacobs' final match in PWFG against Daisuke Aikida on August 13th is the absolute best of them. It's a really damn good 5-minute sprint of a bout. Seriously, the action is so damn fast and crisp here, the strikes are strong, and Jacobs certainly gets to show off the size and strength differences, throwing Aikida about like a ragdoll at points. Indeed, Jacobs does actually get the win in all 3 of these matches, all of them by submission. He uses a butterfly neck crank against Ishikawa and a half crab against Aikida to get the victory. Again, can you ever remember Kane winning a match by submission? I sure as hell can't. And that's not all. On February 28th, Jacobs would also take part in a match style that he would kind of be defined by, a Battle Royal. Yes, a Battle Royal in a shoot-style promotion, one of the various reasons why Fujiwara Gumi is cool as hell. This is a Battle Royal where you only have to be forced outside the ring and not necessarily over the top rope, and while you would think Big Jacobs would have an advantage here, he ends up out early after he gets taken down and literally everyone else in the ring teams up in order to push him out of there under the bottom rope. So even if these matches are obviously quite unimportant when it comes to the career of Glen Jacobs, they are certainly very curious, and they do actually end up being quite fun to watch as well. Of course, they basically all consist of things that Glen Jacobs would literally never need to do when he was playing Kane, although even then, you may remember that there would be the odd little Kane match that would, suddenly, go all technical and he'd do things he'd normally never do. There's one with Albert in 2001, and another one with Big Show in 2006. One of these matches is surprisingly good, and the other one is more just utterly weird. But hey, this PWFG material does show that he could actually go a fair bit, at least in his younger days. They're not utterly amazing matches, and I wouldn't say that Jacobs is the best part in any of them, but he's definitely mixing it up in there, and the bout against Aikida is worth a watch. Apparently there's also a Korakuen Hall match from 1996 on a rather unknown martial arts festival card where he faced Koji Kitao. That sounds even stranger, I must say. Probably very bad, but I haven't been able to find any footage of it. I almost wish that Glen Jacobs had ended up taking part in Battle Arts based on the stuff we've got here, though. That would have definitely been something to see. We've just covered Glen Jacobs, so it makes perfect sense to cover his brother, doesn't it? Because yes, there's definitely a bit to talk about when it comes to The Undertaker in Japan, especially because it does indeed involve Mark Calaway wrestling as The Undertaker, as opposed to just being himself or some other more obscure gimmick in his early days. Seeing as it's basically impossible to associate Undertaker with anywhere else other than the Fed, just the idea of seeing him in another promotion's ring is completely out there, let alone a pro-res one. But it did happen a couple of times, and the results are definitely worth looking at. Now, it should be mentioned that before The Undertaker came to pass, Mark Calaway did wrestle a single tour for New Japan in February-March of 1990, where he was billed as Punisher Dice Morgan. He mainly tagged with other foreigners such as Scott Hall, Corporal Kirchner, and Pegasus Kid, although he did have one singles match against Shinya Hashimoto. I don't believe any footage of this bout exists, unfortunately. Anywho, we're obviously concentrating on Undertaker here. A chunk of this involves angles and promotions that I have touched on previously, but it's worth looking at them in more detail. First up, we take a trip over to the SWS. Undertaker appearing here isn't totally surprising. This is the short-lived but big money promotion that had Genichiro Tenryu as its top star, and they quickly fostered a close relationship with the WWF. A fair bit of WWF talent would make their way over to SWS as a result of that partnership, with the most notable example being the SWS WWF Super Wrestle Tokyo Dome card in December 91, headlined by Tenryu going up against Hulk Hogan. Even with this in mind, The Undertaker does feel like it's going to be a pretty strange fit. It's such a sports entertainment gimmick that you wonder if he's just going to totally be a fish out of water. This, as well as him obviously being a pretty big name, perhaps explains why he only ever appeared twice in SWS, both times in March of 1992, only a couple of months before SWS as a whole was wrapped up. The first of these bouts, on March the 18th, sees Taker take on Takashi Ishikawa in Niigata. If you've seen any Taker squash from this time period, you kind of know the deal here. Ishikawa barely gets any hits in, we see the flying clothesline, a bit of old school, a chokeslam, and before too long Ishikawa's taken to Tombstone City in just under 4 minutes. Simple as, and the crowd is rather dead for the dead man. They may well have been a bit hotter for Taker's second match, mind, a much longer affair against Haku in the Korakuen Hall, always one of the hottest wrestling venues around after all. However, this match doesn't appear to be available, annoyingly. This may be because SWS's TV programming was cancelled only a couple of days after the show, so perhaps it wasn't broadcast at all. Happily, we do have another chance to see Undertaker and Haku going at it. A few months later, after SWS had closed, they'd face each other on the 15th of September in Yokohama for Wrestle Association R, or WAR. It's Tenryu's new promotion, one that'll be a lot more successful than SWS, and Tenryu retains the relationship he had with the WWF. This is actually a combined WWF and WAR show, headlined by Tenryu going up against Ric Flair. The 12,000 strong crowd for this show is definitely more excitable and hotter than the one we saw in Niigata. They're no doubt happier to be watching a new and fresh promotion as opposed to a clearly dying one. The match itself isn't exactly the most interesting ever, although a few things are worth noting. Firstly, War sure as hell pulled out all the stops for Taker's entrance. He's brought in via coffin thanks to some druids, complete with Paul Bearer doing his legendary shtick. Secondly, geez, Haku is loud in this match. I don't know, maybe I never quite noticed it before, but he makes Bob Backlund sound like a pipsqueak. Thirdly, I did toy with covering the almighty Tongan in this vid, but, well, he was mainly a very solid pair of hands indeed, booked tons for All Japan and here in War, and generally just reliable as hell. There's not much interest in. Except for one quite ridiculous incident. Remember Koji Kitao? Disgraced Yokozuna, guy who shot on Earthquake, got head knocked off by Takada? Well, he wrestled in War too, and in one 1994 match, Koji Kitao actually tried to shoot on Haku, taking some liberties with the strikes. I mean, wow. Haku handles it professionally enough. A couple of snug hits and a rather stiff dropkick in the corner is enough to stop this immediately. But of all the exceptionally dumb things Kitao did, I'm not sure anything quite tops trying to take liberties with the man who is basically the uncontested toughest son of a bitch in the history of pro wrestling. Anyway, yeah, this match. Not much to say. Haku gets a bit of offense, but it's only enough to get Taker to sit up. Before too long, it's a chokeslam, it's a tombstone, and the match is done in a little over 5 minutes. Again, the crowd were quite hot for it though. Anyway, we've not got yet to the real meat of Taker in Japan. What we have here is a proper full-on dose of pure-cut sports entertainment, a mini-feud of sorts between an equally mysterious wrestler in a promotion that's hardly the one you'd expect but is kind of weirdly suited for it. The mini-feud in question is between The Undertaker and Jinsei Shinzaki, and in a roundabout way it kind of involves someone else who Taker never faced but would certainly have been a dream match level opponent for him, the Great Muta. This whole thing kicks off inside the WWF on the 9th of May 1994 during a tour of Japan. The Fed actually brings Jinsei Shinzaki in to face Taker on a show in Osaka. Indeed, Shinzaki would be a part of all 4 shows on this Japan tour alongside other talents from War. There's a couple more intriguing Tenryu matches here, including singles bouts against Yokozuna and once again Randy Savage. Still, the matchup between Shinzaki and Taker is definitely interesting, considering that on one hand there's a fair few differences. Taker is obviously a lot bigger in terms of both stature and status, but on the other hand, well, the mysterious gimmicks do kind of fit. Indeed, the Hakushi gimmick is largely born here on this tour. I don't think he wore the kanji stencil all over his body before this. A fan shot of the match does exist, and again it does generally go as expected. But while Taker is obviously going to win this, Shinzaki is able to have a pretty decent showing against the Deadman, getting quite a bit of offense in. We even get Shinzaki's handler, perhaps the future Shinji, holding up a death mask of Undertaker before the bout. Naturally, Taker wins, catching Shinzaki off a body press attempt and hitting the tombstone, but it's an okay house show sprint. Shinzaki impressed a great deal on this tour, and a decision had been made to bring him into the Fed, and so we get the debut of Hakushi in November of '94. Alas, there was never any interaction between Hakushi and Taker during his run, house shows or otherwise, although it still produced some good wrestling, even in a rather crap time. After his time with WWF finished in March of 1996, Shinzaki returned to Japan on April 29th for a single, pretty big match in New Japan, the Battle Formation show in the Tokyo Dome, where Shinzaki's essentially playing the Hakushi character and represents a force for good, whereas the Great Muta is a force for evil. And on this night, well, evil triumphed. Shinzaki tries his damnedest, but Muta eventually wins an exceptionally bloody tussle with the moonsault. The main symbolism comes during the match. Muta breaks Shinzaki's prayer board, cuts him up with it, and then writes the kanji for death or die on it with his blood. Basically, this signals the death of Hakushi. Now that's basically it for the moment. Shinzaki continues to wrestle as plain old Jinsei Shinzaki and Michinoku Pro and all of that, until Michinoku and the WWF start working together in 1997. Through this came the chance to book Undertaker on their October 10th card in Sumo Hall, the company's biggest show of the year, against Shinzaki wrestling as Hakushi. Other WWF involvement on the card, aside from Tucker taking on Great Sasuke in the main event, saw Chris Candido coming in for a tag match and Sonny being the ring announcer for the aforementioned main event. And so we finally get the full proper Undertaker vs Hakushi experience. And obviously it's got as much sports entertainment as you can eat. It's all about the entrances. Hakushi is, after all, undead now. He's brought in via coffin, still covered in dirt, and his seemingly lifeless body is placed in the ring as Taker makes his own entrance. Obviously no Paul Bearer this time, although this gives Taker the opportunity to reunite with his first manager. Yes, that is Bruce Pritchard accompanying him. Hakushi's body gradually springs to life when the bell rings, and the match begins proper. Now, I would be lying if I said this was a hidden gem or anything. In many ways, it often comes across like an extended squash. Taker most certainly gets all the shots in, and you can bet your ass that he's not going to let Hakushi outshine him by doing his prayer rope walk halfway across the ring, not even on his home turf. Hakushi does get the odd hope spot here and there, even the chance to do a big dive and land some telling diving headbutts, but it's never too long before Taker gets the advantage again, and eventually it's about time for the finish, which is, of course, chokeslam, hand across throat, Tombstone City, and it's all over. Hakushi gamely tries against the toughest of enemies, but loses in 12 minutes 18, at which point his body is once again returned to the coffin and carried out. Now it must be said, the audience do lap all of these antics up. It's a promotion based around the love of damn near anything pro wrestling, no matter how silly it may be to others, so the Michinoku Pro crowds are game for damn near well everything, and 1997 Undertaker certainly ends up working well with them. I suppose this weirdly ends up being about two strange journeys to Japan. Not just The Undertaker's, where he pretty much ends up doing what you would expect, but also Jinsei Shinzaki's WWF character. After this, the Hakushi character will actually be brought back on the odd special occasion, the most significant of which happened quite recently on January 22nd, 2023, when Hakushi teamed with Akira and Naomichi Marufuji to wrestle the team of Great Muta, Stin and Darby Allin in Keiji Muto's final ever match under the Muta gimmick. Needless to say, that resulted in a lot more fireworks, and a fair bit more blood as well. In Puro, the character of Hakushi would forever be aligned with Muta, and indeed with Muto. The pair would also on occasion team together, with Muto adopting the alternate guise of Kakushi Muso, covering himself in kanji, and adopting similar Buddhist themes to what you would find in the Hakushi gimmick. It's all rather interesting and amusing history. Hopefully you've got that from the other entries too, and you've enjoyed this video. Please do feel free to hit the various thumbs up, subscribe and notification related buttons of engagement, and until the next time, bye for now.